A roadmap to reaching a final deal within 60 days? That's how mediators, Qatar and Pakistan, have described the result of the first round of US-Iran negotiations, which went deep into the night in Switzerland on Sunday. According to a joint statement from Qatar and Pakistan, the two sides, meaning the US and Iran, have agreed on a roadmap to reaching a final deal within 60 days. To facilitate that, a high-level committee, a deconfliction cell, working groups, and a line of communication will be established. Yet, let's be honest, serious issues remain. The nuclear issue took 6 parties at least 18 months to negotiate. How does the Trump administration expect to get it done in just 2? Next is the Strait of Hormuz, with both sides, again, I mean the US and Iran, threatening tolls. Can they find a way back to free and open access? And last but not least is the issue of Israel, which has refused to stop striking Lebanon. How seriously can we take the talks going forward? Can there really be a deal that can last? Welcome to this edition of The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Joining me today in the studio, Wen Jing, Postdoctoral Fellow at Tsinghua University Center for International Security and Strategy from Suzhou, Southern China. Mohsen Soldust, Assistant Professor in the Department of International Studies at Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University. And from Istanbul, Turkey, Anton Fedayan, Associate Professor in the History Department at American University. Welcome to the show, the three of you. And let me go to Ms. Wen Jing first. Help us understand exactly what we're looking at as this negotiation. Is it the victor, the United States, getting what it deserves from Iran, or the loser, United States, making concessions from Iran? I think to Iran, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks for your question. I think it's very hard to define as a victor or winner in the whole procedure. I think as has been almost 4 months from the start of this war, we see conflict between US, Israel, and Iran. And both US and Iran has lost too much. From US side, I think they have spent too much energy and monies into this war, and for Iran, actually, they had lost too much in the war. They burned their buildings and also many missiles, weapons, or many ways. So I think not any side is being a winner in the whole procedure.
Professor Soldust, what is your take? I think the fact that you suffered damage does not necessarily mean that you lose.
That's right. But the thing is that what we have at the moment is just a memorandum of understanding. So it's not clear who is going to win, who is going to lose. But that fragile memorandum of understanding is kept alive while still one of the major battlefields is not controlled by the signatories. So at this stage, because it is not clear what the clauses are going to be in the final settlement agreement, and we don't know who is going to stick to the points that they agree with. Therefore, it's pretty early to say who is the loser, who is the winner here. But definitely, US and Israel, they have not achieved any of the goals they initially talked about for starting the war. Iran's nuclear program is pretty much in place. Iran's original policy hasn't changed. The missile program is non-negotiable for Iran. So US and Israel have not achieved any of those goals, the stated goals of the war. So if we want to define winning the war or losing the war, until now, we can say that they haven't won the war based on what they actually define as the major goals of the war.
Well, some people are saying, given the disparity in terms of power, in terms of prowess, the fact that the US has not won the war means that the US has lost this war. Anton, Professor Fedayan, what is your take?
Well, I think that this is a strategic win for Iran. I don't think anyone has any doubt that the United States can continue to pound Iran from a distance. That's what the Americans have always done very well. They park their ships or their bases away from territories that they attack, and they certainly have the weapons to bring damage to any country at any point of the planet. But look, just over the past 26 years, we've seen the Americans do this over and over again, and the damage they sustain is always the long-term strategic damage. And I would agree with my colleague who just spoke. I would just add that not only has nothing fundamentally changed in Iran, but the one fundamental change that we have seen is that the Iranians are willing to close down the Strait of Hormuz. No one was certain that they would actually take this step before the military action began, and now the entire planet knows that that is exactly what they are willing to do. And that is their pressure point. That is their nuclear weapon, so to speak, in the economic sense of the term. And they have wielded it with incredible efficiency. So what we're going to see coming out of Washington, I think, is going to be an enormous amount of political theater, Trump claiming victories all over the place. But in the end, I don't think that the United States is going to come out of this war a victor in the strategic sense at all.
So the reason why I asked this question, because it matters a lot as to, to understand exactly what's going on, what's being negotiated, and what's the potential outcome. Ms. Wen Jing, from all of the information that we're gathering, well, my personal opinion, if that matters at all, is that the United States has failed miserably because it's not able to overcome Iran, which is much less powerful a country, and the United States, as my second guest has said, has not achieved any of its stated goals. So how seriously shall we take these negotiations? Today they can be going on, tomorrow it's derailed, the third day it can be back on track. How much attention should we give to this kind of talks?
So for one side, I agree with you. I think, as you said, I think for U.S. he had not achieved any goal from the start, right? He won the region change, and he wanted the regime change, but not right. So, and for Israel, actually they undermine the ability of Iran in the region, like that what he did done in Hezbollah. But you can see the conflict is still going on, and Hezbollah still is a very important player in the region, and they still have many danger to Israel. But for another side, I think the negotiation is also necessary. Why? The war has continued for 4 months, and you can see there's still sincere conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Now the war between Israel and Iran has stopped, but the war between Israel and Hezbollah still has continued. So if there's no negotiation achieved, or there's no communication, I think the war will trigger sincere conflict in the region. So I think right now for both U.S. and Iran, both sides hope to get a deal, because for U.S. they faced a very sincere pressure domestically, and for Iran actually they had tackled the sanction for many years, so they hope to get a deal with the U.S. so they can get more money and more investment from abroad. So I think at the current stage, to negotiate is better than to just stop. This is my take.
Professor Sodust, how are you following these talks? Because there are a lot of detail, a lot of fast developing threats going on. Today they walk away, tomorrow they refuse to take pictures, but the third day they have an encouraging progress. How are you following these talks? Help us there.
Yeah, there's a lot of going back and forth. The thing is that this memorandum of understanding is bilateral on paper, yet it's quite trilateral in practice. So we've got Israel, who is absent in these talks and doesn't see itself bound by what U.S. and Iran are agreeing on the negotiation table. So we can see that this memorandum of understanding was built on a very thin layer of ice, and that thin layer of ice has already begun cracking. because the Lebanon file is working as a veto channel at the moment. Israel is not going to agree to the terms and conditions.
Yeah, shall we spend any time at all? Shall we spend any time at all, so long as Israel is acting with a free, with a blank check, that any deal can work?
No, that's actually the weakness of the deal. The structural issue, the enforcement structure of the deal is very weak. And that's why it's not going to work. That's why even yesterday, when they were going to talk in Switzerland, Israel was still striking south of Lebanon. Iranians threatened to pull out of the talks again. Trump got in contact with Netanyahu, asking him to partially withdraw from the south of Lebanon. So it's not going to work. The problem is that when you send some real estate agents to such sensitive negotiations, you cannot expect to achieve a very meaningful deal. When you think that you can just use your pressure to bring Iran to the negotiation table, talk on behalf of Israel, who is absent in the talks, this is what we get. We see the violations of the clauses, the terms, everything, and then we see a lot of threatening messages going back and forth between the two sides. So structurally, this is a very weak memorandum of understanding, and I'm not really optimistic about how this is going to bring us a durable settlement in the long term. It is just a diplomatic channel, provides the bridge between the two sides. It reduces the risk of direct conflict between Iran and US, but this is very temporary.
Professor Fediashin, with what sentiments are you approaching these negotiations? Do you think everything is there for lasting peace to be attempted, at least, to be reached this time?
Attempted, yes, but attempted is the key word. I'm not expecting anything constructive to come out of these negotiations. Because Israel is not participating, one, and two, on the American side, Donald Trump is the ultimate decider, and we saw what he did with the JCPOA, which was a very serious diplomatic negotiation that involved 6 parties, multiple countries, which, by the way, disagreed on multiple issues outside of the Iranian nuclear program, which is why it took months to hammer this out. And he just ripped it up and walked away. And this is, by the way, a fundamental issue with all democracies. And I'm a big believer in democracy. But look, one of its problems is that until a deal is ratified by the U.S. Senate, succeeding administration can simply walk away from a deal that its predecessor has negotiated. And with Donald Trump, things get even more complicated because he says one thing and then he often does another. In general, I am very happy that the sides are talking to each other. At least we know that there is communication. But do I sincerely think that within the next 2 months, we're going to have a deal that's going to last? Absolutely not. Personally, I think that this is Donald Trump trying to manipulate the domestic scene in the United States because he has midterm elections coming up, and I think it's a guarantee that the Republicans are going to lose the House, quite possibly the Senate. And so this is all political theater as he's trying to mitigate the damage that he himself had done to his party and to his administration because of this war. He genuinely thought that this was going to be a second Venezuela. They're going to go in within 3 days, they're going to topple the regime, and then Americans will simply forget about this and the problem will solve itself. And that's not how it's turned out. So now he has to act and create a theater in order to make it seem like the Republicans know what they are doing.
Ms. Wen Jing, your opinion here. Are we wasting our time talking about negotiations, talking about a possible deal?
Yeah, just actually I can express my opinion. I think right now I prefer to say that at the current stage it's more than crisis management than to get a ground deal. But I still want to say crisis management is so essential at the current stage. Because
what specifically do you mean by that, crisis management? On which side, for instance?
I mean, as I want to say from U.S. side, if he got a deal with Iran, everybody, right, like me and our other guests today, we all know that U.S. had got a deal with Iran. Okay, you cannot start a war to Iran anymore, right?
But that's provided that the U.S. will abide by its own words, and here we have no guarantee.
But if no agreement, other than that, so
Will an agreement make any difference? That's my question.
I mean,
given the track record of the United States. I'm sorry, I'm challenging you here because I seriously doubt it.
yeah, I mean, as I want to say that Israel is out of control now, but I still think
Do you think the U.S. is in control of itself?
U.S. is for many times is out of control. But I still want to say if they got a deal with Iran, it's a people decision making deal, right? So I think he will have some for Donald Trump. He will hesitate to react to Iran.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I get your point. Mr. Soldus, so at a compromised level, right, we cannot expect excellent behavior from a track record naughty one. But in the case of some kind of deal that's reached between the two sides and by the Trump administration, do you think it makes it harder for the Trump administration to backtrack, to eat its own words?
Well, Donald Trump does that on a daily basis. He agreed with this MOU a few days ago. Just yesterday, he mentioned that I want to get the tolls for the Strait of Hormuz, which was in contradiction of the first clause of the MOU, the 14th clause MOU. So there's no guarantee that he's going to stick to what he signs. And that is the problem that I think everybody agrees with, that he is acting on impulse. He doesn't have a clear strategy. He doesn't have a clear idea what he wants to do. This is a quagmire he didn't want to be in. He thought that he can have a precise and decisive victory in the very first days of the war. He was fooled by Benjamin Netanyahu, and because the Israeli prime minister pretty much owns Donald Trump. So that's the case that we see right now. He's in a conflict. He's desperate to get out of it, but he doesn't know how to end that, because he didn't achieve any of the things that he mentioned in the beginning of the war. And he has kept changing his words. He has never abided by what he signs or by what he says. That makes everything much more complicated and more fragile than a normal deal could be.
So, Professor Fadiashin, what can we reasonably and rationally expect to be done so that the situation at least doesn't get re-escalated out of control? If a deal is not serious enough, war is not an option for either side. Should they just keep talking and not talking and, complaining and having war of words, so on and so forth?
Well, I think we're looking at a very shaky suspension of hostilities for the foreseeable future, where Israel continues to fight Hezbollah. Iran performs occasional strikes on Israel, but the United States more or less stays out of the direct conflict. It does not defend Israel by then striking Iran, and all of this will be done in order to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. I think that the overriding goal for the Trump administration is to keep the gas prices down in the United States. It doesn't care about the rest of the world, but it does care about its own population, because they have a midterm election coming up, and that's going to determine how effectively Donald Trump will rule in the next 2 years, the second half of his second and last presidential term. So the Americans are going to do whatever they need to do to keep the strait open, to essentially keep Iran in suspension in terms of tension, but with enough pressure to hope that there will be another regime change set of uprisings within the country. And so this area will be in permanent tension for the foreseeable future.
Wow. Ms. Wen Jing, what is your prediction? Do you agree that this is going to be the status quo going forward for the time being?
Actually, I hold some very, hesitate to show my opinions on the Strait of Hormuz, right? Why? Because I think the Strait of Hormuz is a very important card which Iran holds. And it's very easily, actually, for Iran to control this card. But I mean, I saw the news the day before yesterday. The actually U.S. and Iran got a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But you can see that Israel just struck Lebanon, the southern part of Lebanon again. So Iran said, okay, you just damaged the deal. Okay, I will not follow up the deal we get. So the closure of Strait of Hormuz happened again. So I think right now the situation is changing so fast, but I still hold that Iran will hold this card sincerely. And I think and I think this is also the main reason why I adhere to that U.S. and Iran have to get a deal and have to negotiate, because the Strait of Hormuz really has the sincere implication in the global energy. Yeah. So I think it's a core issue here.
Yeah, I'm not saying they shouldn't be talking. I'm not saying that they shouldn't negotiate, but I cannot bring myself to take it very seriously. Okay. Yeah, that they're going to honor this deal. And another big point, another big reason why I I'm very skeptical, is that the legitimacy of any deal that comes out of bilateral negotiation for an internationally important matter, which is nuclear non-proliferation. And Mr. Sodust, am I overstepping my mind and say, I don't think this is a matter in the hands of the United States or Iran together. I think it is a multilateral issue.
That's right. Yeah. If we look at the previous nuclear agreement, the 2015 nuclear agreement, that was a nuclear agreement after years of negotiations, enshrined in UN Security Council resolution P5+1. They signed up to the agreement, but of course Donald Trump tore up the deal. But that was what a meaningful deal meant to be. But this one is just something that Donald Trump sends a couple of people, as I said again, real estate agents or his son-in-law with no diplomatic experience in diplomatic negotiations, to come up with a deal with so far just a 14-clause, 2-pagers. They call it a memorandum of understanding. So this is not an issue that could be resolved this way. Of course, again, if this was between just US and Iran, perhaps there were some chances of just agreeing with something on the surface, because let's remember that Donald Trump likes the theatrics of signing up a deal, taking some photos, and then say goodbye to the other side. That's what he did during his first term with North Korea. But this time, as I said, we've got a party to the conflict which is not signing anything, none of these memorandum of understanding, no deal, anything, and that is Israel. So Donald Trump is not going to get what he got in other theaters or in other cases. That's what makes this very complicated and makes us less hopeful about coming to a durable settlement or agreement.
Professor Fediashin, Israel, of course, is the big spanner in the works, if I can use this expression. But we are really talking about the legitimacy of these negotiations. Look, if you read the MOU, it sounds as if the United States can just order the IAEA to do this or that. The United States can just, mandate the UN Security Council to lift sanctions on Iran. It can just order the UN Security Council to pass a binding resolution in terms of the Iran issue. No, the United States does not have that power, but it makes it sound as if it has, and that's why I have a problem with it.
Yes, absolutely. Moreover, of course, a memorandum of understanding is a document that is not legally binding on any of the parties that put it together and signed it. It's simply a memorandum. That's why it's not called a treaty. And therefore, it leaves the entire spectrum of decisions open to both sides. Given that Donald Trump is a leader driven by impulse and by personal goals, political, financial, and a whole bunch of others, it will be entirely up to him to decide how he plays his cards. Unfortunately, Benjamin Netanyahu has a very clear goal, which is to stay in power, and if it takes war to keep him there, he has demonstrated fairly consistently that he is willing to use that card. So again, this is why I do not put much faith into the MOU, into the talks that are going on. It's good that the two sides are communicating on the one hand, but this is not going to lead to a long-term solution, which means that the Middle East and the Persian Gulf had better buckle up, because the next 2 years are going to be this status of constant tensions, punctuated by short, sharp military bursts, and the Strait of Hormuz will be opened and closed depending on the situation. And as any oil executive will tell you, that is not a very good way to run a business, and oil markets will be reacting to that.
Yeah, and the emotional swings, not to mention, that we have to experience on a daily basis. That's why I'm not euphoric when I hear encouraging progress is made in these kind of negotiations. I'm sorry. Let's wait a day and talk about it. And not to mention implications for the rest of the world as a result of rising or unstable oil prices. So, Ms. Wen Jing, is there any other way we can deal with this more rationally if, this kind of negotiations is not to be really looked forward to? What can be done? What should we do, really, as members of the world?
Yes, Liu-Xin, actually, I did some research during Obama's 8 years in Middle East policy. Actually, Obama administration took almost 18 months to get a deal with Iran, and our professors today all agree that 2 months negotiation is too short time for both sides to get a deal. This is the one question, and the other is that I think bilateral negotiation cannot get a deal anymore. And I think we have to just welcome more players, not only in the region. I mean, not just Qatar or Pakistan. I mean, we have to include like China and other important or influential players in the table, just back to the table.
Okay.
Yeah, and then.
Yeah, sorry for interrupting. I have very little time left. Go to Professor Sodust. Not that I'm working for the national television of China, but I do not mean that China need to be there. If China is not there, it's not a good deal. That's not what I'm saying. But Mr. Sodust, really looking at a workable solution forward, what kind of framework should we be working on? Keep it within 1 minute, please. Yeah.
Sure. The kind of framework that we should be looking at is that U.S. declares victory, they pull out of the war, try to control Israel for the time being. Then we can be hopeful that there will be some meaningful negotiations between Iran. There will be other stakeholders added to the table, China, Russia, and other regional powers. Then there might be some sort of prospects of a durable settlement for the conflict.
Professor Fedi-Action, in 10 seconds, if you can. What is your potential vision for solution? Sorry.
Yep, we've had experiences of this before in the 19th century, and those were the negotiations in Vienna, for example, after the Napoleonic Wars. It's going to have to be a Eurasian affair with the United States participating.
All right. Many thanks to my guests. We have to leave it there. Wen Jing, Postdoctoral Fellow at Tsinghua University, Mohsen Sodust, Assistant Professor at the Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University, and Anton Fedi-Action at the American University. Thank you so much. With that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu-Xin, coming to you live from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook, X, and YouTube using the handle Liu-Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.